Hello and welcome back to What the Fuck is SRE? I'm Jen, your host, and I'm really excited for the next track or the next session, because for me, it comes down to breaking down barriers. And it just seems to be a logical one, but me as an outsider or observer, I guess you could call me, the fact that governance, risk, and compliance is not really communicating that well with SRE, and talking reliability going with security. These seem really logical to me, but with a lot of things involving the culture and the tech side of tech, they don't always mesh together. So I'm really happy to bring Mario on board. So come to the stage, Mario, aka Donkey Kong.
Donkey Kong. I thought I'd dress up, try to see if I can be more effective at communicating with GRC people. Let's see if it works.
Fantastic. Well, share your screen, please, Mario, and take it away, because we're very excited to have this conversation. And your use of the little imp, which, by the way, we're trying to find a name for. So everybody give us your names on Twitter.
Cool. Thank you very much.
Mario. Thank you.
Right. So thank you all for coming today. So today what I'm going to talk about is why GRC needs SRE. Right? There's a SRE has been around for over a decade now. In the GRC functions, governance, risk, and compliance have been slow in kind of understanding how they could be doing things differently. Now that SRE is a thing and it's starting to become more prevalent, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Right, so I'm a CISO at Platt Global. We're a consulting company, and I also lead the security consulting practice. So doing interim CISO, fractional CISO type roles for clients in the general consulting. I've been in tech for over 20 years. I've more than 18 in security. So I started as a penetration tester. I got interested in hacking back in 1998 when I was 13 years old, and I've been doing security stuff every day since. So I started as a penetration tester. I did ops in security engineering for over 10 years. And since about 2014, that I've been focusing mostly on governance, risk, and compliance, and leadership, leading teams, etc. I'm the project leader for SVS User Stories. That is part of the Open Security Summit. We're trying to get agile stories for people to use. I am course instructor for DevSecOps for leaders that talks about world mapping, Canavan, complexity, and those are the things and how they affect security. And safety science, resilience engineering. I'm a great enthusiast. I've been reading about it and trying to apply it to security for a couple of years now. So a lot of you, usually when I talk with tech people and mention the GRC, people, first question is, what are you talking about, right? So it's probably a good place to start. So GRC stands for Governance, Risk Management and Compliance. And from Wikipedia, it's kind of a de-integrated collection of capabilities that enable an organization to reliably achieve objectives, address uncertainty, and act with integrity. Right? So that's what they say. So basically, the GRC makes sure that we are planning, right? That we are trying to understand what level of uncertainty exists on our plans, and we are trying to make sure that we do things properly, and we keep due diligence and can evidence due diligence in how we deliver and build products and services. So the three different areas, the first one is governance. So that's about aligning processes and actions with the organization's business goals. So making sure that things work together, they communicate together, and that the organization is successful in achieving the things it plans for. We have the discipline of risk management, which is about trying to identify and address the risks that the organizations are exposed to. And there's compliance, right? A lot of companies have either legal, regulatory, contractual, or even framework requirements if you need to do SOC 2 audits or ISO 27001 certification. So those are all things that drive the need for compliance-related activities. So those are the three things. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at state of play on each of them, right? To try and get a common understanding. This is obviously my opinion on where we are in terms of each of these three and how SRE can potentially help. So the first one is that I think governance is stuck in this command and control and centralized governance models. Right? It's what we've been doing for probably the past 20 to 50 years in terms of assurance functions. And there's pretty much that a kind of ivory tower. I tell you what to do and you go out and do it. Right? Very command and control, very I expect standardization, very not very good to interact with. Governance is also over focused on specialism, right? It's the narrow role of the compliance manager. It's the narrow role of the risk manager. It's the narrow role of everything else, right? We are really pretty much focused on specialisms and not in integrating this knowledge on the value chains, right? How the organization is creating value. Another big problem, in my opinion, is that we keep on framing the security problem as one of awareness, right? And we are not framing the security problem as one of goal conflicts and trade-offs, right? That people are having to make to keep their systems up and running, right? And to make sure that if we told the client we'll deliver a feature by date X, that we keep on to those dates, right? And we achieve our objectives. It also is very much detached from operational realities, right? The hierarchical information filtering that happens normally between having a conversation with the engineer in something that is concerned about appearing on a board report. It's going to go through many, many layers of abstraction. A classic example here, which is old, in the Challenger accident with NASA. One of the things on that report that Feynman mentioned was that on one of the slides that talked about the risks relating to the Challenger launch, there was the use of the critical word 4 times on the same slide. And it meant anything from it's probably going to be a bit late or cost a bit more to everyone dies, right? And that is the problem with a lot of this kind of filtering up and the abstractions and the filtering to make sure it's in business speak, right? You lose a lot of the good stuff, of the things that would probably act you to change you to act differently, right? And it's not where we are. And finally, we've got these organizational traumas that get ossified into processes and practices. Right? So a lot of organizations, for instance, an example that I see a lot is a certificate expired and everything went bad. Right? And then the organization creates all of these convoluted processes and complicated and with reviews, etc., to make sure that doesn't happen again. Right? And you've got these processes that can ossify over time and make it really cumbersome when you've got kind of 5, 10, or 20 years of doing this. So that's where we are in terms of governance. In terms of compliance, we've got this problem, right, which I think is the elephant in the room. We've got the policies and procedures that are written by compliance professionals that tend not to have the domain expertise to fully understand the implications of the policies and procedures that they're writing. Right? So we end up having 2 things. We've got the policy and procedure that was written by the bureaucrats. And then we've got how we actually do things, because the real world is the real world and doesn't work like the policy or procedure thinks it does. A great article to talk about this difference is from Stephen Shorrock, The Varieties of Human Work, which is useful to illustrate this point, because there's the work as imagined by the bureaucrats that wrote the policies and all of that, how they think the work works, right? And there's work as done, right, from the practitioners, what they actually do day in and day out and how they approach their craft. And usually, if you don't have domain expertise in these compliance functions, what will tend to happen is those documents will be completely unrelated to the operational realities, right? And we've got some issues that happen in terms of communication when that happens. And finally, the state of play on risk management. So this is what risk managers think they do, right? It's neat, it's clean, it has arrows, it looks really cool. So they establish context, you do that risk assessment stuff, risk identification and evaluation. Typically, you'll try to find a way to normalize all of those. You can either do it with darts and see if it falls on a 3, on a red or on an amber, or you can just kind of hand wave and stuff kind of works itself out. But in the real world, that's not really how people approach risk management, right? This ends up being how risk management is actually done. We've got a bunch of accepted industry best practices and a bunch of training and ingrained patterns, right? The security industry, we're all reading from the same books, we're all taking the same certifications, and we all don't do that much technical work, generally speaking, right? This is obviously a generalization in GRC. So what ends up happening is we see what we expect to see, and we do not see what we do not expect to see. So because risk and compliance managers often tend to have their view of work is one of work as imagined, not work as actually done, then this risk analysis process basically all it does is it's a control stop hat, right? Because we see what we expect to see. You've got this type of problem. Here's my control. You operation A, team A, you can get that control. You get that control. You get that control, and then we hold everyone culpable or accountable. Sorry, it was my English. Accountable for when they don't keep those controls up to date and working as we expect them. So, okay, got it. But what does any of this have to do with SRE? This should be about the time where you're starting to ask yourself what we're doing here. But we're getting there. So this is my hypothesis, right? I believe that the structures that allow governance of technology, right, and the things that we do to manage SRE does to manage reliability, so operational risk, in what you already do to enforce operational standards, that's exactly what we're trying to do in GRC. Maybe the scope is a bit different, but what you're doing is already helps meet a lot of these. So maybe you can leverage it, and I think we'd all be better off for it. So what would that leveraging look like? So let's look at each of them of the GRC letters. So the first one from a governance point of view is that most security teams, at least from experience, they don't really like to engage in the question of how much security should I be doing, right? And that's a solved problem in SRE. You've got the error budget mechanics that we can also apply to security in terms of patches and all of those, and some other use cases that probably people haven't thought too much yet. But that helps answer the question: how much security should I be doing? Thinking, applying the idea, the mechanics of error budget to how we approach security would bring a lot of benefits into governance as a whole, because we then have an organizational dynamic and the information and the data to actually have a cadence into how we approach and how we ask ourselves the question, how much should I be doing? How much security should I be doing? The issue here is also SRE is best placed to understand these trade-offs and constraints for decision making, right? And this is something that governance could leverage. Obviously, it would require us to actually have those conversations, and for the SRE functions to feel like it's a conversation that they can have in terms of exposing what are those trade-offs and constraints. But it's, again, my hypothesis that if we were better at getting feedback, at eliciting information from SRE functions, so that we can then better articulate issues of governance and how we're managing risk, again, I think we'd be much better off. And finally, I think this is what I like to call the first thing to do is level the playing field. Right? And what I mean by that is, with regards to reliability, you probably wouldn't be in a position to manage it until you actually had items on your backlogs. Right? Things happen, you add items to your backlogs, and then you make those calls as a team of when is the right time to start doing something about it. Now, in most organizations that I work with, I can see bugs, I can see reliability issues, I can see all of that type of stuff on their backlogs, but I don't see security. And because we don't sometimes don't have the security stuff making it into backlogs, and are kind of separate and hidden in third-party tools that your security team bot gave you access, but you actually never logged in. It becomes difficult, right? The product owners and the engineers, they're not seeing this stuff on their backlog, so we're not leveling the playing field, right? So that's kind of where I usually suggest we start. And in terms of conception of risk, the view of the risk manager is very much a linear causality model, right? So we decompose the components that we're building, and we think, so what if this thing does this? And we think about a control that we could put so that we don't have any type of operational impact out of that interaction. But anyone, particularly SREs, etc., if you've all seen the classic example, you make a code change today, and only 2 months down the line, a special set of conditions start happening, and then we start having a problem from something that we did 2 months ago. Right? This is normal for an SRE. This is normal for software development. This is something that you all understand and you know you're going to face again. Right? It's going to keep on happening. But if you go have this conversation with a GRC person, risk managers and governance, their view of the problem is likely be you didn't do a good enough job thinking about the conditions that will lead to failure. So you need to try harder. Right? And that's where we shouldn't be, right? Because it's not about that. Everyone knows that you are all under different pressures, and things need to move on. right? So this is a model that a lot of the SRE community is familiar with. So Rasmussen's dynamic risk model, this is how risk actually plays out for you. Right? There's a bunch, there's activities, there's an operating point that is dynamic, that is changing every minute, every hour, every week. And you've got all of that white space in the middle that represents the variability in your normal work. Right? So that world of the compliance manager that thinks that this procedure is always followed, that's not true, right? Because that the document, those documents don't say all of the things that you typically need to do, right? There's always variability, and most of that variability, it's okay, because it's you guys, you're being the experts, right? It's variability that if it's bad, generally know if it's bad variability or a good type of variability. Right? But our world of risk and compliance doesn't really think that way. So this is how it works out for you. You've got a boundary of an acceptable workload. So you need to think about what are the skills, what people need to do, and how busy are the processes by which people do their work. There's a boundary of economic failure, where things aren't delivered on time and on budget, and everything that can contribute to getting to that point. And we also have a boundary of incidents, right? Where we've got a reliability issue, we've got a security incident, we have a data breach. And the thing about the boundary on the left is that there's an error margin, right? There's this idea of a marginal boundary, which is how people are making decisions, that typically is different from a GRC person to an engineer, because a GRC person will typically think that the further away from that barrier they have their operating control, the better they are, right? But we know from high reliability organizations since the 80s and 90s that that's not actually the case. High reliability organizations, they tend to operate closer to that point. And they can do that because that also helps establish a common mental model of how the systems work across the teams. And there's less erosion over time of some of the controls that would be eroded if we had just too much fat, right? If we had too much process, too many things trying to push it the other way, the pressures of better, faster, cheaper from management in moving away from economic failure and workload failure will tend to push us towards this accident boundary. But again, this is not a view of risk that risk managers typically have. Now, the other part that SRE could really play a role in helping organization manage risk better is the relationship of this operating point with the accident boundaries. And there are many things that security, the GRC functions do that I would call them antipatterns in terms of how we can help you, SRE teams, keep our systems within acceptable performance. So one of the antipatterns is that the policy is being inconsiderate of the operational constraints, right? And this is the value. This is, I think, the key reason why SRE and GRC should be talking more with each other, right? To make sure that that view of work as imagined that risk and compliance managers have in the world of the actual work, in what people do in terms of practice every day, that we reconcile those discrepancies, right? Because they will be different, and the more we can make sure that we've got our policies say things that we can actually do, then that both makes sense. It actually informative, and you're not creating a business liability from having written on paper that you do things a way that no one actually does it because it doesn't make sense in the operational context. The other part is on awareness campaigns, right? That are not related to work performance. So this is where, again, SRE and GRC functions could potentially work together to try and understand what are the skills that we need when we log on my machine at 9 a.m. to do my job as an engineer, as whoever in the organization. So trying to SRE explaining the needs of the engineers because they understand that reality better, and trying to say, look, these are the things that in part of normal work, the team should be able to be proficient at doing, and should have the mental model of understanding what are the triggers that now require me to do something slightly different. Right? And that's also something that is usually missing. And finally, we have the feedback loops alerting on impractical performance boundaries as another anti-pattern. So what this means is when we have a policy implemented in a way that doesn't make operational sense, you will usually also have a lot of tooling that are going to just spin out a bunch of stuff, right? Will lead to alert fatigue and will lead to people not paying much attention, right? Because if 6 months ago we had 7 vulnerabilities that became 70, then became 700, we weren't breached. Over time, people start discounting what the value of that metric actually is, right? So thinking about when working together with the SRE teams in GRC to make sure that the feedback loops are alerting on boundaries that are actually practical, that are actionable, that someone is going to do something about it. That's kind of another way to try and bridge that gap, right? In how GRC and SRE could be working together to ensure that we keep running secure systems. More than that, from a risk perspective, we do have we should be implementing different risk strategies, and we're not. Right? So a lot of what risk management is currently in InfoSec is that top bit, right? The empirical strategy, which I think generally we're getting as an industry quite good at doing. So what that means is that's the place where we've got we can have automated governance, we can have some automation, and that we kind of know the type of things that we need to do. Right? So we're creating a new S3 bucket, encrypted. You're creating a new BS storage, encrypted. You are creating a new thing. You need to create a role for it, right? It's those types of things that that the current practices around risk management are actually not too bad at doing, right? Obviously, there are challenges, etc., and it's unequally distributed, but generally, I think this is a solved problem in the industry. What is not a solved problem are the other two. Again, this is where I think SRE can add a lot of value. The first one being learning from incidents, right? So in the SRE community, we are getting a lot of more focus on the socio-technical aspects of systems, and that's not something that GRC teams even know what it is, generally speaking. So in the idea that we have our security incident policy may say that we do a review after we've got incident to learning, but if you've been through a security one, you know that's probably not what you'd want, right? Because it tends to be much more, we understand that linear causality in that deconstruction that we're talking about. Within the first 10 minutes, we're going to find a variation of human error. That's just how it goes, because someone surely didn't follow a procedure somewhere, and that's where we're going to stop, right? And the problem with that is that we now know from safety science that those kinds of variability in people not following procedures happens both in business success and in business failure. So that alone cannot possibly justify most of the times the type of impact that you saw, or is the whole explanation for the things that are happening. So having a more socio-technical approach on how we learn from security incidents as well is something that GRC would be much better off on. Just being quite honest, just give it to you, right? Just say, run our incident process for us, because yours is probably much better than ours. But I'm probably pushing it a bit too far. But in the last one is about system entanglement in blast radius, right? And that's the language of complexity. We do know the scenarios of what constitutes unacceptable losses, right? Things such as losing confidentiality of our information. If you're running financial transactions, it's the integrity of those transactions. But the challenge here is that if we don't have the language of complexity, and we don't have methods that help us kind of explore with multiple viewpoints, not the single version of truth, because hopefully in this SRE community, people know that's not a thing. But in GRC people don't. We still go out the version of truth, and not realizing that what is actually happening is there are different views. Everyone had a different experience, and everyone was probably trying to. It made sense at the time, whatever it is that they did, right? In a non-confrontational way. So those are the two aspects. So this evolutionary strategy and this analytical strategy, they are not solved problems in GRC. And I think we're much closer to kind of solving them as a problem within the SRE communities. And I think adding those two strategies to the way we manage risk in GRC would completely change how things work for the better. Finally, on compliance. So, what role could SRE play in compliance? So, the first one is on the appropriateness of artifacts, right? And affects our organization dynamics. So, being in the position to challenge the GRC teams and say, look, you're asking me to stop what I'm doing to go fill up a spreadsheet that is a bit weird, right? And all of how that affects organization dynamics and relationships, etc. So, a bit of I'd say. Coaching in terms of artifacts and how they enable communication and all of those, and working with those teams to see how we can optimize the value chains, right, and make security as easy as possible for everyone. You could also do other things that you already do with a focus on security. Readiness reviews, standards enforcement, your ways to deal with toil, right? Having something thing as code, right? Once we start going to policy as code, etc., we can start a lot of the things that you do to ensure standards enforcement, etc. They work exactly the same for security. And again, these are, I think, missed opportunities if we don't start thinking more of it this way. So if you are thinking about integrating GRC outcomes into some of the SRE practices, I will suggest there are largely kind of two strategies that you can take with it. One of them is an integrated strategy, right, where you can acquire expertise within the SRE structure. So companies that have big SRE functions, I know Indeed, for instance, and some other ones are doing that as well. They're starting to have an SRE security kind of team within the big SRE department. And I think that works really well because SRE, you know how to hire for these types of skills that we would need in this thing. You could help do all of that, and then reuse all of the mechanics and the processes, etc., to kind of provide that service. Obviously, the main constraint here is the security team, the GRC teams needs to let go, right? Quite simply, and that's not something that is a given. It's going to have to you're going to have to put some energy into making that happen. The other strategy that you can potentially have is a connected strategy. So instead of creating a new function within SRE to help and do some of these things, what you do is you change how the security team is currently structured, right, in the types of services that they provide, so that they adapt themselves to providing some of these services that no one may be currently doing. Right. So those are kind of the two strategies if you would like to think about actually doing this. So, but what can you do about it though, right? So I think, as with everything, it's good to start with conversations, right? So having that conversation with governance, particularly around the error budget mechanics, and what metrics could get you started, that would be a way to do it. The other part is thinking about roles in ceremonies, because you may not have the right people to be in the same room as you to talk about particular issues, right? Sometimes security people have the thing of not being approachable, not having the required expertise, and they end up becoming more bottlenecks in that meeting than actually helping, right? So getting the right individual is important. On risk, you can show them how you manage reliability, how risk plays out in your role, how you try to manage, and how you apply these different strategies to try and understand how things work. They would pretty much be much better off for it. In non-compliance, you already do a lot of the technical standards enforcement. Why not for the security too? You're already doing it. You already know how to do it, and you're already good at doing it. So again, missed opportunity if we don't take advantage of that. So last slide. Key takeaways that I wanted to have today is that I think that SRE is uniquely positioned to help balance the how much, right, between reliability, feature work, and yes, security too. If we were to add the security onto all of those things that you're already doing, then it actually, as I mentioned, levels the playing field, right? And you can start making decisions that understand the constraints and all of the moving pieces in everything that there is to do, right? So that things can be balanced and done. The GRC understands the work as imagined, but not work as done, right? And that's the insight that you bring to the table. Learning how to position that in a good way, in a way that is helpful for them as well, would get both teams a long way. And also, SRE tends to adopt practices that have strong socio-technical focus, right? And GRC doesn't even know that's a word, generally speaking. I've been trying to do my best, but it's just me and a few others. So we need more people talking about these things. But GRC, they understand business liabilities, right? And they play an important role in managing them. So SRE, I think, could benefit from understanding those constraints a bit better, right? So in terms of what is the audit process, how does that affect? How is the relationship with the auditor? What things we may need to do? So those are all things that are having direct impact from SRE, I think, would make GRC lives much easier as well. And last point, GRC assurance practices are generally outdated, right? People are still working on Word documents, spreadsheets, and all of that type of stuff, and asking that Lisa asked Mario, that asked Paul, that asked Barbara, right? And that's how we do audits. You've been doing audits for over 100 years. So I think GRC needs to understand that CI/CD are systems of record, right? And there's a lot of opportunities in automated governance that we can take from the templates and the things that you SRE already do, because that's your expertise. And that was me. Hopefully I convinced you that GRC and SRE can work together. I think we would all be much better for it. Yeah, and those are my contact lists. Would love to get some questions.
Absolutely. And we love bringing everyone together. So that's totally great. That is what DevSecOps and whatever else DevSecOps, well, we can call it, is all about. A question from the audience.
Okay.
How do you actually learn from incidents and share that learning? Documenting, structuring through Git repos, build a framework. How can GRC keep up to date and learn from these incidents? Because I'm guessing they're not being copied on postmortems yet.
Yeah. So there are a couple of angles at that particular one. So I think the first thing to do, and that's a problem overall, is if you already have something working in terms of the retrospectives, let's try and leverage that. Right? If your security teams would kind of understand the process and how they could potentially leverage that for them, it doesn't mean that they would do it, because there's a lot of it wasn't built here, it wasn't me doing it, but at least you start the conversation to see if that works. I think the format itself, whether it's on Git or a document or on Confluence or something else, to me, it just needs to be available in a place that people can access. What is most important to me is how you conduct the learning, right? And that's where I think the big gaps are, because it's one thing to kind of ask the usual questions. So you should have followed this procedure, did you? Okay, now and you start putting those notes and having an approach where trying to elicit information to understand why it made sense at the time, what were the pressures, what were the kind of not just the thing itself, but the context around it, right? And I think that's what we're mainly missing in security, is doing the work of understanding the human behind it and what was happening between different stakeholders and how things came together. I think that's the biggest gap.
And the only problem with that is giving a lot of people access to a tool is probably not what GRC wants to do at all. Yep. Even if it is a learning tool. So it needs to all come back to, we're going to see a recurring underpinning theme of psychological safety and safe to speak up, safe to talk, and breaking down barriers, because it's the only way you can achieve this observability and reliability cross-organizational. So thank you so much, Mario. That was super interesting. I took a ton of notes. You had me at socio-technical. I started perking up once you started with that, and you saying arrows are cool. I was like, oh, this isn't that technical. It's very interesting to me. It's very important. So thank you so much. Go
thank you for
wreck
having
things
me.
Like Donkey Kong. Y'all, thank you so much for joining. Don't forget to keep networking. You've got a few minutes break. You've got maybe 15 minutes or less. You can take your break, have a moment of relaxation, check out our charities. We're helping baby dragons. Come on now. That's interesting and freakishly adorable. So I'm going to let y'all go take that break, and we'll see you soon with Policy as Code with OPA. Thank you.